On a sweltering afternoon in August 1943, Private First Class Kenji Nakamura pressed his face against the chain-link fence of Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, watching in bewildered fascination as American guards engaged in what appeared to be a ritualistic ceremony involving wooden sticks, a small white sphere, and loud cheering. The sounds of Strike 3 and Safe at Home meant nothing to the 22-year-old former Imperial Navy radioman who had been captured during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but the obvious joy and competitive spirit displayed by his captors challenged everything he had been taught about American character. Behind him, dozens of other Japanese prisoners gathered at the fence, equally mystified by the spectacle unfolding on the makeshift baseball diamond that American personnel had carved out of the Wisconsin prairie. The guards, still wearing their military uniforms, but with sleeves rolled up and caps turned backward, moved with an enthusiasm that seemed completely at odds with the serious business of managing enemy prisoners of war. "What are they doing, Nakamura-san?" whispered Corporal Hiroshi Yamada, a former aircraft mechanic from Osaka, whose mechanical mind tried to analyze the mysterious game's complex rules and strategies. "They seem to be taking turns throwing that ball at each other, but sometimes they run in circles. Is this some form of combat training?" The question reflected the confusion that all the Japanese prisoners felt as they observed their first baseball game. Having been taught that Americans were weak, pleasure-seeking people who lacked the spiritual discipline necessary for serious warfare, the sight of their captors engaging in what appeared to be an elaborate form of play during duty hours seemed to confirm their expectations of American frivolity. The telegram that had reached the War Department 3 weeks earlier had outlined the experimental recreational program being implemented at selected POW camps. Request authorization for expanded recreational activities, including organized sports and cultural events. Preliminary observations suggest such programs may improve prisoner morale and camp security while providing opportunities for positive American cultural influence. Camp McCoy had been selected as a test site for these experimental programs, partly because of its commanding officer, Colonel Robert Dutch Henderson, a former high school principal from Minnesota who understood the psychological importance of maintaining prisoner morale and preventing the despair that could lead to suicide attempts or violent incidents. Henderson's background in education had convinced him that properly managed recreational activities could serve both humanitarian and strategic purposes. The Japanese prisoners who had arrived at Camp McCoy represented a diverse cross-section of Imperial military personnel captured during various Pacific operations. Unlike the stereotypical image of fanatical soldiers willing to die rather than surrender, many had been rendered unconscious by wounds or explosions and awakened in American field hospitals with no opportunity to choose death over capture. Nakamura himself had been pulled from the water after his cruiser was sunk during a night engagement, his survival more a matter of luck than choice. The shame of capture weighed heavily on all the prisoners, who had been raised in a military culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. Their adjustment to prisoner status was complicated by guilt, confusion about their future, and uncertainty about how their families would react to news of their survival. Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan, an Irish-American guard from Boston, who had played semi-professional baseball before the war, had been observing the prisoners' interest in the daily games with growing curiosity. His suggestion to Colonel Henderson that the prisoners might be allowed to participate in recreational activities had been met with initial skepticism from security-conscious officers who worried about providing potential weapons to enemy personnel. "Colonel, these boys look about as miserable as anyone I've ever seen," Sullivan had argued during a staff meeting about prisoner management. "Back home, we always said that baseball could teach anyone about American values, teamwork, fair play, healthy competition. Maybe if these fellows learned to play our national pastime, they'd understand what we're really fighting for." The idea of using baseball as a tool for cultural indoctrination had precedent in American domestic policy, where immigrant communities had been encouraged to participate in organized sports as a means of assimilation. The application of similar concepts to enemy prisoners represented an innovative approach to prisoner management that emphasized rehabilitation over mere detention. Dr. James Morrison, the camp's chief medical officer and a former psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin, had strongly supported Sullivan's proposal based on his observations of prisoner behavior. The high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation among the Japanese POWs suggested that conventional detention methods were inadequate for managing prisoners from a culture that viewed capture as spiritual death. These men are suffering from profound psychological trauma that goes beyond simple combat stress, Morrison had explained to Henderson. Their entire sense of identity and self-worth has been shattered by capture. Traditional Japanese military culture provides no framework for honorable survival as a prisoner. We need to help them construct new identities that allow them to live with dignity while in our custody. The first attempt to introduce baseball to the Japanese prisoners had occurred almost by accident when a foul ball from the guards' game had rolled into the prisoner compound. Nakamura, whose quick reflexes had served him well as a radio operator, had instinctively caught the ball and thrown it back toward the American players with surprising accuracy and force. Sergeant Sullivan, impressed by the throw, had called out, "Nice arm," and gestured for Nakamura to throw the ball again. The simple interaction, conducted entirely through hand signals and facial expressions, had created a moment of human connection that transcended the official prisoner-guard relationship. Colonel Henderson had been observing this interaction from his office window, recognizing its potential significance for camp morale and prisoner management. His decision to authorize limited recreational interaction between guards and prisoners represented a departure from standard military protocol that emphasized maintaining strict separation between captors and captives. The first organized recreational activity had been a demonstration game where American guards explained baseball rules to interested prisoners through a combination of English words, Japanese phrases learned from Nisei interpreters, and elaborate pantomime. The cultural translation of baseball concepts proved challenging, as many American terms had no Japanese equivalents. The concept of fair play was particularly difficult to convey to prisoners who had been trained in military traditions that emphasized absolute obedience to authority and victory at any cost. The idea that players were expected to accept umpire decisions without argument, even when they disagreed, seemed to contradict everything they understood about competitive behavior. Private Taro Sato, a former infantry soldier from rural Kyushu who had never seen any sport more complex than traditional sumo wrestling, found himself fascinated by baseball's intricate rules and strategies. His diary entries, written in careful Japanese characters on paper provided by the Red Cross, recorded his growing appreciation for the game's complexity. The American guards have taught us their strange ball game today. At first it seemed simple. Throw the ball, hit the ball, run in circles. But I'm beginning to understand that this game requires great strategy and teamwork. Each player must know not only his own role, but also anticipate the actions of all others. It reminds me of military tactics, but without the death. The introduction of hot dogs as a standard recreational meal had created an even greater cultural shock than baseball itself. The sight of American guards consuming cylindrical meat products from bread tubes while drinking carbonated beverages seemed to confirm Japanese propaganda about American dietary habits being both strange and unhealthy. Corporal Yamada's first encounter with a hot dog had been recorded in a letter to his family that would be heavily censored before mailing. The Americans eat the strangest foods. They take meat and form it into the shape of a stick, then place it inside bread that has been cut to look like a boat. They cover this with yellow and red sauces that smell sweet but taste sour. Yet they seem to enjoy this food greatly, especially when watching their ball game. The cultural significance of hot dogs in American recreational life was completely lost on the Japanese prisoners, who came from a culinary tradition that emphasized fresh ingredients, careful preparation, and aesthetic presentation. The concept of mass-produced convenience food, designed primarily for quick consumption during leisure activities, represented an entirely different relationship between food and social interaction. However, the communal aspect of sharing hot dogs during baseball games began to create unexpected opportunities for cultural exchange. American guards who offered to share their food with prisoners found themselves engaged in discussions about cooking methods, family recipes, and regional food preferences that revealed common human experiences beneath surface cultural differences. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's decision to teach interested prisoners how to properly prepare and consume hot dogs led to some of the camp's most memorable cross-cultural moments. His demonstration of proper mustard application techniques and his explanation of regional hot dog variations created opportunities for conversation that went far beyond simple food preparation. "You see, Nakamura," Sullivan explained through a combination of English words and hand gestures, "in Chicago, they put everything on a hot dog: tomatoes, pickles, peppers, celery salt. In New York, they keep it simple, just mustard and sauerkraut. Each place has its own way, but the hot dog brings everyone together." The concept of regional food variations resonated with Japanese prisoners who came from a country where local culinary traditions were sources of great pride and identity. The idea that Americans, despite their apparent cultural uniformity, also maintained regional differences in food preparation provided a point of connection that helped humanize their captors. The success of these initial recreational programs had attracted attention from higher military authorities who were struggling with prisoner management issues at camps throughout the United States. The low rates of disciplinary problems and suicide attempts at Camp McCoy, compared to facilities that maintained stricter separation between guards and prisoners, suggested that recreational programs could serve important security functions. Brigadier General William Donovan, responsible for POW operations in the Midwest region, had visited Camp McCoy in late August to observe the recreational programs firsthand. His report to the War Department would influence prisoner management policies at camps throughout the American military system. The experimental recreational programs at Camp McCoy have produced measurable improvements in prisoner morale and camp security. The introduction of organized sports and shared meals has reduced incident rates while providing opportunities for positive cultural influence that may prove valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts. The psychological impact of recreational activities extended beyond simple entertainment to address fundamental questions of identity and purpose that plagued Japanese prisoners struggling to find meaning in their survival. The opportunity to learn new skills and participate in organized competition provided goals and achievements that helped counteract the despair associated with capture and detention. Dr. Morrison's clinical observations documented significant improvements in prisoner mental health among those who participated in recreational activities. Subjects show marked reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety when engaged in structured recreational programs. The competitive and social aspects of organized sports appear to provide frameworks for rebuilding self-esteem and social connection that are essential for psychological recovery. The daily routine at Camp McCoy had evolved to include afternoon recreational periods when weather permitted, with baseball games becoming the most popular activity among both guards and prisoners. The sight of former enemies playing together while sharing hot dogs and soft drinks created an atmosphere that challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of international conflict. As summer turned to autumn in 1943, the recreational programs at Camp McCoy had established precedents for prisoner treatment that would influence American policies throughout the war. The demonstration that former enemies could interact peacefully when engaged in shared activities provided hope for post-war reconciliation while serving immediate humanitarian purposes. The letters and diary entries produced by Japanese prisoners during this period would later provide historians with unique insights into cultural exchange under the most unlikely circumstances. Their descriptions of learning American games and food revealed the human capacity for adaptation and connection, even in situations designed to emphasize division and hostility. Nakamura's diary entry from August 30, 1943, captured the transformation that was beginning to occur among the prisoners. "Today, I hit the ball with the wooden stick for the first time. The American guards cheered for me as if I were their teammate rather than their prisoner. I do not understand why they show such kindness to their enemies, but I'm beginning to think that Americans are not what our officers told us they were." The crisp morning air of September 1943 carried the sound of wooden bats connecting with baseballs across the exercise yard of Camp McCoy, where an extraordinary transformation was taking place. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura stood at home plate, his hands gripping a Louisville Slugger with the same intensity he had once applied to operating radio equipment aboard his sunken cruiser. The American guard serving as pitcher, Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan, called out encouragement in a mixture of English and broken Japanese that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. "Okay, Nakamura-san, keep your eye on the ball, swing level through the zone." The cultural translation of baseball terminology had created its own unique dialect within the camp, as American guards struggled to explain concepts like sacrifice fly and stolen base to prisoners who had never encountered organized team sports beyond traditional Japanese martial arts. The linguistic challenges were compounded by fundamental differences in competitive philosophy that made some baseball concepts nearly impossible to convey. Corporal Hiroshi Yamada had become the prisoner's unofficial translator for baseball terms, his mechanical background helping him understand the systematic nature of the game's rules and strategies. His notebook, carefully maintained despite limited paper supplies, contained detailed diagrams of baseball plays alongside Japanese translations of American sports terminology that would later prove invaluable for cultural exchange. "Today, Sullivan-san taught us about the squeeze play," Yamada wrote in his diary that evening. "This is when a runner on third base runs toward home while the batter tries to hit the ball softly so the runner can score. It requires perfect timing and trust between teammates. I think this play demonstrates something important about American military thinking. They value coordination and mutual support more than individual heroism." The observation reflected growing understanding among the prisoners that baseball was more than simple entertainment. The game's emphasis on teamwork, strategic thinking, and adherence to complex rules provided insights into American culture that challenged their preconceptions about their captors' character and values. Dr. James Morrison, the camp's psychiatrist, had been documenting the psychological changes occurring among prisoners who participated in the baseball program. His weekly reports to military medical authorities described remarkable improvements in morale and mental health that exceeded anything achieved through traditional therapeutic interventions. The prisoners who participate in baseball show significantly reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety, Morrison wrote in his October assessment. More importantly, they demonstrate renewed sense of purpose and social connection. The game provides a framework for healthy competition and achievement that helps counteract the psychological trauma of capture and detention. The success of the baseball program had attracted the attention of Colonel Henderson, who authorized expansion of recreational activities to include other American sports and cultural activities. His pragmatic approach to prisoner management recognized that maintaining good morale served both humanitarian and security purposes, reducing the likelihood of suicide attempts or escape efforts that could endanger both prisoners and guards. The introduction of other American foods alongside hot dogs had created additional opportunities for cultural exchange. The camp's mess hall had begun serving hamburgers, apple pie, and ice cream during recreational periods, providing prisoners with exposure to American cuisine that went far beyond simple nutrition to encompass social and cultural meaning. Private Taro Sato's letters to his family, heavily censored but still revealing, described his amazement at American eating habits. "The guards eat ice cream, even when the weather is cold. They say it tastes better after playing their ball game. Yesterday, Sullivan-san shared his apple pie with me. It was very sweet, sweeter than any dessert we make in Japan, but somehow it seemed appropriate for celebrating a good game." The concept of celebratory food consumed specifically for recreational purposes was foreign to prisoners who came from a culture where food was prepared and consumed with careful attention to season, ceremony, and social hierarchy. The casual American approach to eating for pleasure during leisure activities represented a different relationship between food, work, and social interaction. Staff Sergeant Sullivan had appointed himself as unofficial cultural ambassador for American recreational traditions, taking particular pride in teaching Japanese prisoners the finer points of baseball strategy and hot dog preparation. His enthusiasm for sharing American culture reflected genuine affection for the prisoners under his supervision, whom he had come to regard as students rather than enemies. "These boys are natural athletes," Sullivan reported to Colonel Henderson during one of their weekly briefings. "Nakamura has developed into one of the best catchers I've ever seen. Great arm, quick reflexes, really understands the game. Yamada's got a good eye at the plate and smart base running instincts. They're picking up the fundamentals faster than most American kids." The praise reflected growing recognition among American personnel that the Japanese prisoners possessed skills and intelligence that had been obscured by wartime propaganda. The baseball field had become a venue for discovering common humanity beneath surface differences in language, culture, and national allegiance. The winter months of 1943-44 brought indoor recreational activities that further expanded cultural exchange opportunities. The camp's recreation hall had been equipped with ping-pong tables, checkers sets, and a radio that provided music and news broadcasts. These activities created more intimate settings for conversation and relationship building between guards and prisoners. The radio programs particularly fascinated the Japanese prisoners who had been isolated from news and entertainment during their months of captivity. American popular music, comedy programs, and baseball broadcasts provided exposure to American culture that went far beyond the formal educational materials provided by military authorities. Nakamura's diary entries from this period revealed growing appreciation for American popular culture. Tonight, we listened to a baseball game on the radio. Even though I could not understand all the words, I could feel the excitement of the crowd and the tension of the game. The announcer's voice rose and fell with the action, making me feel as if I were sitting in the stadium. American voices sound different when they are happy than when they are angry. The observation reflected sophisticated understanding of cultural expression that suggested the prisoners were developing genuine appreciation for American society beyond simple tactical intelligence gathering. The emotional content of American recreational culture was beginning to resonate with prisoners who had been taught to view their captors as fundamentally different from themselves. The spring of 1944 brought renewed enthusiasm for outdoor recreational activities, with the camp's baseball diamond expanded and improved to accommodate growing participation by both guards and prisoners. The quality of play had improved dramatically as prisoners mastered fundamental skills and began to understand strategic subtleties that made baseball mentally as well as physically challenging. Dr. Morrison's psychological assessments documented continuing improvements in prisoner mental health and social adjustment. The baseball program has created a social structure that provides meaning and purpose for participants while fostering positive relationships between guards and prisoners. The competitive framework allows for healthy expression of aggression while maintaining cooperative relationships necessary for effective camp management. The success of recreational programs at Camp McCoy had influenced policy decisions at POW camps throughout the United States, with baseball and other organized sports becoming standard elements of prisoner management. The demonstration that former enemies could interact peacefully during recreational activities provided models for post-war reconstruction efforts that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. The letters written by Japanese prisoners to their families during this period, while subject to military censorship, conveyed information about American culture that would influence Japanese understanding of their former enemies. The descriptions of recreational activities, food, and social interactions challenged propaganda images while providing evidence of American character that differed significantly from official Japanese portrayals. Yamada's letter to his brother, written in March 1944, exemplified the changing perceptions occurring among the prisoners. The Americans are not what we were taught to expect. They play games with great seriousness and share their food with generous hearts. Their guards treat us with respect and seem genuinely interested in our welfare. I do not understand how such people could be our enemies, but I am grateful for their kindness during this difficult time. The personal relationships developing between individual guards and prisoners had begun to transcend the official framework that brought them together. Shared meals, recreational activities, and daily conversations had created friendships that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of national enmity and international conflict. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's relationship with Nakamura exemplified the transformation occurring throughout the camp. Their daily conversations about baseball strategy had evolved into discussions about family, home, and hopes for the future that revealed common human experiences beneath surface differences in nationality and military service. "Nakamura reminds me of my younger brother back in Boston," Sullivan wrote to his family in one of his weekly letters. Same quick smile, same competitive spirit, same devotion to his family. Makes me wonder what we're really fighting about when people so much alike end up on opposite sides of a war. The success of the recreational programs had also created challenges for camp administration as the informal relationships between guards and prisoners began to complicate official military hierarchies. The sight of American personnel and enemy prisoners playing together as teammates raised questions about appropriate boundaries in prisoner management that would influence military policies for decades. Colonel Henderson's quarterly report to regional headquarters acknowledged these complications while defending the overall success of the recreational approach. The recreational programs have achieved their primary objectives of maintaining prisoner morale and camp security while providing valuable cultural exchange opportunities. However, the development of personal relationships between guards and prisoners requires careful management to maintain appropriate military discipline and security protocols. The approach represented a delicate balance between humanitarian treatment and security concerns that reflected broader questions about American values and war aims. The demonstration that former enemies could interact peacefully when engaged in shared activities suggested possibilities for post-war reconciliation that went beyond simple military victory. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the recreational programs at Camp McCoy had established precedents for prisoner treatment that would influence American military policy throughout the remainder of the war. The baseball field had become a symbol of American values and culture that challenged both guards and prisoners to reconsider their assumptions about the nature of international conflict. The knowledge and relationships being developed through recreational activities would prove valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts as American officials began planning for the occupation and democratization of Japan. The evidence that Japanese prisoners could adapt to American cultural practices while maintaining their dignity and identity provided hope for broader cultural transformation that could prevent future conflicts. The summer of 1944 brought an intensity to the baseball program at Camp McCoy that transformed what had begun as recreational therapy into something approaching religious devotion. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura stood at the pitcher's mound on a sweltering July afternoon, sweat dripping from his brow as he faced Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan in what had become their daily ritual of competitive excellence. The sight of a Japanese prisoner striking out an American guard with a perfect curveball would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier, yet it had become routine in the strange world behind the wire. "Strike three," called Corporal Yamada, who had naturally evolved into the camp's most respected umpire due to his mechanical precision in calling balls and strikes. His command of both baseball rules and English had made him indispensable for maintaining the integrity of games that had become the emotional centerpiece of camp life. The transformation in Yamada's role reflected broader changes occurring throughout the camp as the recreational programs had evolved from simple diversions into complex social institutions that provided meaning and structure for both prisoners and guards. His diary entries from this period revealed the psychological importance of baseball in maintaining morale and dignity. "Today I called Sullivan-san out on strikes. He did not argue with my decision, even though his teammates needed him to get a hit. This is the American way. Accept the umpire's judgment and play the game with honor. I think this teaches us something important about their democracy. They believe in rules that apply equally to everyone." The observation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American political culture that extended far beyond simple sports appreciation. The prisoners had begun to recognize connections between baseball's emphasis on fair play and the democratic values that their captors claimed to be fighting to preserve. Dr. James Morrison's psychological evaluations had documented remarkable changes in prisoner behavior and mental health as the recreational programs matured. The competitive outlet provided by baseball, combined with the social interaction facilitated by shared meals and cultural exchange, had virtually eliminated the suicide attempts and self-harm incidents that had plagued the camp during its early months. The baseball program has created a social microcosm that allows prisoners to experience American values in practice rather than simply hearing about them in propaganda lectures, Morrison wrote in his comprehensive year-end assessment. The emphasis on teamwork, individual achievement within group success, and adherence to impartial rules provides direct experience with democratic principles that no amount of classroom instruction could convey. The success of the recreational approach had attracted visits from military officials throughout the theater, who observed Camp McCoy's programs as models for implementation at other facilities. The consistently low rates of disciplinary problems and high levels of prisoner cooperation had made the camp a showcase for humane detention practices that served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. The culinary aspect of cultural exchange had expanded beyond hot dogs to include elaborate cookouts that combined American recreational traditions with attempts to accommodate Japanese dietary preferences. The camp's mess personnel had learned to prepare rice dishes and vegetables in styles that reminded prisoners of home, while introducing them to American cooking methods and ingredients. Private Taro Sato had become the unofficial liaison between the mess hall and the Japanese prisoners, his growing English vocabulary and natural diplomatic skills making him valuable for negotiating menus that satisfied both American food service requirements and Japanese cultural expectations. His letters home described these negotiations with humor and appreciation. Yesterday, the American cooks tried to make rice the way we eat it in Japan. They boiled it until it was very soft, then added butter and salt. It tasted strange but showed their good intentions. Sullivan-san said they wanted us to feel at home, even though we are far from home. I think this kindness is more important than getting the rice exactly right. The efforts to accommodate Japanese food preferences had created unexpected opportunities for cultural exchange, as American personnel learned about different approaches to cooking and eating. The discovery that Japanese prisoners had sophisticated knowledge of food preparation and nutrition had challenged stereotypes while providing practical benefits for camp meal planning. The baseball games themselves had evolved into elaborate productions that drew spectators from throughout the camp and surrounding community. Local civilians, initially curious about the unusual sight of Americans and Japanese playing together, had become regular attendees who brought their own cultural perspectives to the sporting events. Mrs. Dorothy Fisher, whose husband was serving in the Pacific Theater, had become a regular spectator despite her initial reservations about fraternizing with enemy prisoners. Her observations, recorded in letters to her husband, revealed the complex emotions that the baseball games evoked among American civilians. I went to watch the prisoners play baseball again today. I know you might think it's strange, given that you're over there fighting these people's countrymen, but seeing them play our national pastime makes them seem less foreign somehow. That young fellow Nakamura has quite an arm. Reminds me of the players we used to watch at County Stadium before the war. The civilian attendance at prison camp baseball games represented a unique form of cultural diplomacy that provided American communities with direct exposure to Japanese prisoners who challenged propaganda stereotypes through their obvious humanity and athletic ability. These interactions would prove valuable for post-war reconciliation efforts by creating personal connections that transcended official political relationships. The competitive excellence achieved by Japanese players had surprised American observers who had underestimated their athletic capabilities and strategic intelligence. Several prisoners had developed skills that rivaled those of professional players, leading to discussions about the possibility of post-war baseball exchanges that could continue the cultural connections being established. Nakamura's development as a pitcher had become legendary throughout the camp, his curveball earning respect from American players who had grown up with the game. His notebook, filled with diagrams of pitching mechanics and strategic observations, revealed the systematic approach he brought to mastering American baseball. The curveball is like radio signal transmission. It requires precise timing and understanding of physics. The ball must be released at exactly the right moment, with proper spin to achieve the desired trajectory. Sullivan-san says I have natural talent, but I know it is the result of careful study and practice. The technical approach that Japanese prisoners brought to baseball reflected their military training and cultural emphasis on continuous improvement through disciplined effort. Their systematic methods for analyzing and improving their play had influenced American players who were accustomed to more casual approaches to recreational sports. The winter of 1944-45 brought indoor activities that further deepened cultural exchange opportunities. The camp's recreation hall had been expanded to include a small library where prisoners could access American books, magazines, and newspapers that provided broader exposure to American society beyond the military environment of the camp. The reading materials had been carefully selected to provide positive but realistic portrayals of American life that could influence prisoner understanding of democratic values and social organization. Popular magazines like Life and Saturday Evening Post gave prisoners glimpses of American family life, work, and leisure that complemented their direct experiences with recreational activities. Yamada's analysis of American popular culture, recorded in his increasingly sophisticated diary entries, revealed growing appreciation for the complexity of American society. The magazines show that Americans have many different ways of living and thinking. Not all Americans are the same, just as not all Japanese are the same. Their magazines show disagreements about politics and social issues, but they discuss these disagreements openly, without fear of punishment. The recognition of diversity within American society had profound implications for prisoners who had been taught that Americans were culturally uniform and spiritually weak. The evidence of vigorous public debate and social criticism suggested a different model of national strength based on diversity rather than conformity. The radio broadcasts that had become popular entertainment during indoor seasons provided additional exposure to American culture through music, comedy, and sports programming. The prisoners' growing English comprehension allowed them to appreciate humor and cultural references that had been incomprehensible during their early months of captivity. The baseball broadcasts were particularly popular, allowing prisoners to experience professional games while developing vocabulary and cultural understanding. The emotional investment that American announcers and fans showed in their teams provided insights into the role of recreational activities in American social life that went beyond simple entertainment. Nakamura's diary entry from December 1944 revealed the emotional impact of these broadcasts. "Tonight we listened to a baseball game from New York. Even though it was winter and no one was playing, they talked about players and teams as if they were discussing family members. I think Americans love their baseball teams the way we love our villages and families. It is not just a game, but a way of belonging to something larger than yourself." The insight demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American culture that suggested genuine appreciation rather than simple tactical intelligence gathering. The emotional connections that Japanese prisoners were developing with American recreational traditions provided foundations for post-war cultural exchange that could influence bilateral relationships for decades. The personal relationships between individual guards and prisoners had deepened through shared recreational experiences that created bonds transcending official military relationships. These friendships had become sources of mutual learning and understanding that challenged participants to reconsider fundamental assumptions about national identity and international conflict. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's relationship with Nakamura had evolved into something resembling brotherhood, with daily conversations about baseball strategy expanding into discussions about family, philosophy, and hopes for the future. Sullivan's letters to his family revealed the transformation in his own thinking about the war and its aftermath. "Nakamura and I have been talking about what we'll do after the war. He wants to introduce baseball to Japan when he gets home, and I've been thinking about maybe going over there to help set up leagues and teach kids the game. Seems crazy to think about visiting a country we're currently bombing, but these friendships we've made here feel more real than the politics that started this whole mess." The vision of post-war cultural exchange through baseball represented possibilities for reconciliation that extended far beyond formal diplomatic relationships. The personal connections being established through recreational activities provided foundations for people-to-people diplomacy that could help heal the wounds created by total war. The success of recreational programs at Camp McCoy had influenced prisoner management policies throughout the American military system, with baseball and other organized sports becoming standard elements of POW camp operations. The demonstration that structured recreational activities could serve both humanitarian and security purposes had provided models for post-war reconstruction efforts that emphasized cultural transformation alongside political reform. As 1945 began, the recreational programs at Camp McCoy had established precedents for cultural exchange that would influence American approaches to international relations throughout the post-war period. The baseball field had become a symbol of American values and a venue for demonstrating that former enemies could interact peacefully when engaged in shared activities that emphasized common humanity over political differences. The knowledge and relationships being developed through recreational activities would prove valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts as American officials prepared for the occupation and democratization of Japan. The evidence that Japanese prisoners could appreciate and participate in American cultural traditions while maintaining their dignity and identity provided hope for broader cultural transformation that could prevent future conflicts. The spring of 1945 brought news that would forever change the dynamics at Camp McCoy, but the cultural transformation that had occurred over nearly 2 years of shared recreational activities had created bonds that would prove more durable than the political circumstances that had brought these men together. As reports of Japan's military collapse reached the Wisconsin camp, both American guards and Japanese prisoners faced the prospect of separation with emotions that neither side had anticipated when the experimental programs first began. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura stood on the pitcher's mound for what might be his final game, gripping the baseball with the same intensity he had once applied to his naval radio equipment. Across the diamond, Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan crouched behind home plate, calling signals with hand gestures that had become as familiar as a shared language developed through months of competition and friendship. "Come on, Nakamura," Sullivan called out in English that the Japanese pitcher now understood perfectly. "Show them that curveball one more time." The scene would have been impossible to imagine when the first Japanese prisoners arrived at Camp McCoy in 1943, suspicious and despairing men who viewed their American captors as alien enemies. Now, in the shadow of Japan's impending surrender, the baseball field had become a symbol of transformation that challenged everything both sides had believed about the nature of international conflict. Colonel Robert Henderson had been documenting the success of the recreational programs for his final report to military headquarters, recognizing that the Camp McCoy experiment would influence American policies toward prisoner treatment and post-war reconstruction for decades to come. His assessment emphasized both the humanitarian benefits and strategic value of cultural exchange programs. The recreational activities initiated at Camp McCoy have achieved unprecedented success in maintaining prisoner morale while providing opportunities for positive cultural influence that may prove valuable for post-war relations with Japan. The baseball program in particular has demonstrated that former enemies can interact cooperatively when engaged in shared activities that emphasize common humanity over political differences. Dr. James Morrison's psychological evaluations had documented remarkable changes in prisoner behavior and mental health that exceeded anything achieved through conventional therapeutic interventions. The competitive outlet provided by baseball, combined with the social connections facilitated by shared meals and cultural activities, had created a model for rehabilitation that could be applied to other post-conflict situations. The transformation observed among Japanese prisoners participating in recreational programs suggests that cultural exchange can serve as an effective tool for reducing hostility and building understanding between former enemies, Morrison wrote in his comprehensive final assessment. The skills and attitudes developed through these programs could prove valuable for Japan's post-war reconstruction and integration into the international community. The news of Japan's surrender reached Camp McCoy on August 15, 1945, creating complex emotions among both prisoners and guards who had developed relationships that transcended their official roles. The end of hostilities meant that the unique community that had developed around the baseball field would soon be dissolved, but the knowledge and friendships that had been created would endure. Nakamura's diary entry from that historic day captured the mixed feelings that many prisoners experienced. "Today the war ended, but I do not feel the joy I expected. Yes, the killing has stopped, and I will eventually see my family again. But I am also sad to leave this place where I have learned so much and made such unexpected friendships. Sullivan-san and the other guards have shown me that Americans are not the enemies we were taught to hate." The personal relationships that had developed between individual guards and prisoners had become the most significant outcome of the recreational programs, creating networks of friendship and understanding that would influence post-war relations between the two countries. These human connections would prove more valuable than formal diplomatic agreements in building foundations for lasting peace. Staff Sergeant Sullivan's reaction to news of Japan's surrender reflected the emotional investment that American personnel had developed in their relationships with Japanese prisoners. "I should be celebrating victory, but all I can think about is how much I'm going to miss these guys. Nakamura has become like a brother to me, and Yamada is one of the smartest men I've ever met. The idea of them going back to a country we've been bombing feels wrong somehow. I hope we can stay in touch." The repatriation process that began in autumn 1945 created opportunities for the Japanese prisoners to carry their newly acquired knowledge of American culture back to their homeland, where it would influence Japan's post-war development in ways that no one could have anticipated. The baseball skills, English vocabulary, and cultural understanding that had been developed through recreational programs would prove valuable assets for a nation seeking to rebuild its relationships with the international community. Corporal Hiroshi Yamada had spent his final weeks at Camp McCoy carefully copying baseball rules and diagrams into a notebook that he planned to take back to Japan. His systematic documentation of American recreational culture reflected the same attention to detail that had made him an effective aircraft mechanic and would later serve him well as one of Japan's pioneering baseball organizers. I have written down everything I can remember about baseball: the rules, the strategies, the equipment, and most importantly, the spirit of fair play that makes the game meaningful, Yamada wrote in his final diary entry from Camp McCoy. When I return to Japan, I want to teach this game to children who have known only war and destruction. Perhaps baseball can help them learn to compete without hatred, to strive for excellence without destroying their opponents. The vision of using baseball as a tool for post-war reconstruction reflected understanding of the game's cultural significance that went far beyond simple entertainment. The Japanese prisoners had recognized that baseball embodied American values of teamwork, fair play, and democratic participation that could help transform their society's approach to competition and conflict resolution. The farewell ceremonies organized at Camp McCoy created moments of recognition and appreciation that transcended the official prisoner-guard relationships. American personnel presented departing prisoners with baseballs autographed by their teammates, while the Japanese prisoners offered handmade gifts that reflected their traditional crafts and cultural heritage. Nakamura's farewell speech, delivered in English that had improved dramatically during his captivity, captured the transformation that had occurred through recreational activities. "We came here as enemies, but we leave as friends. You have taught us not only your national game, but also your national character. We have learned that Americans value fairness, friendship, and fun in ways that make them strong without being cruel. We will remember these lessons always." The speech reflected sophisticated understanding of American culture that would prove valuable for Japan's post-war relationship with the United States. The positive impressions created through recreational programs had generated goodwill that would facilitate cooperation during the occupation period and beyond. The documentation compiled by prisoners during their captivity provided comprehensive information about American recreational culture that would influence Japan's development of organized sports programs. The detailed notes on baseball rules, equipment specifications, and playing techniques would serve as foundational materials for establishing baseball leagues throughout Japan. Private Taro Sato had focused his documentation efforts on American food culture, creating detailed recipes and preparation methods for hot dogs, hamburgers, and other recreational foods that had become associated with baseball games. His notes would later influence the development of Japanese fast food industries that combined American convenience concepts with traditional Japanese ingredients and preparation methods. "The Americans have taught me that food can be simple and still bring people together," Sato wrote in his final letter from Camp McCoy. "Hot dogs and baseball go together like rice and chopsticks in Japan. When we build baseball fields in Japan, we must also teach people to enjoy American foods that make the games complete." The cultural package of baseball and associated American recreational traditions would be transplanted to Japan as an integrated system that reflected the comprehensive nature of the cultural exchange that had occurred at Camp McCoy. The former prisoners would serve as cultural ambassadors who could introduce not only new games, but also new approaches to leisure, competition, and social interaction. The immediate post-war period in Japan provided ideal conditions for introducing American recreational culture as part of broader democratization efforts. General Douglas MacArthur's administration actively encouraged cultural exchanges that could help transform Japanese society, and former prisoners with direct experience of American recreational traditions became valuable resources for these programs. Nakamura returned to his home prefecture of Hiroshima in late 1945 to find a devastated landscape that bore little resemblance to the community he had left. The atomic bombing had destroyed not only buildings and infrastructure, but also social networks and cultural institutions that had provided meaning and continuity for local residents. His decision to organize baseball games for local children reflected understanding of the game's potential for rebuilding community spirit and providing hope for the future. The makeshift diamond he created from rubble and debris became a gathering place where former enemies' recreational traditions helped heal the wounds of total war. The children had forgotten how to play, Nakamura wrote to Sullivan in one of their first post-war letters. They knew only how to hide from bombs and search for food, but when I taught them to hit a baseball and run the bases, I could see joy returning to their faces. The game you taught me is helping my people remember what it means to be alive, rather than merely surviving. The therapeutic value of baseball for war-traumatized populations had not been anticipated by the original recreational programs at Camp McCoy, but it became one of the most significant benefits of the cultural exchange. The combination of physical activity, social interaction, and structured competition provided frameworks for psychological recovery that complemented formal reconstruction efforts. Yamada's work in Tokyo focused on establishing organized baseball leagues that could provide recreational opportunities for adults as well as children. His documentation of American league structures and competitive systems enabled him to create organizational frameworks that adapted American models to Japanese social conditions and cultural preferences. The Tokyo Baseball Association, established by Yamada in 1947, became a model for similar organizations throughout Japan that combined recreational activities with community development and social integration. The association's emphasis on fair play, teamwork, and inclusive participation reflected values learned through prisoner recreational programs at Camp McCoy. The equipment requirements for establishing baseball programs in Japan created opportunities for ongoing economic and cultural exchange with the United States. American sporting goods manufacturers began developing markets in occupied Japan, while Japanese companies learned to produce baseball equipment that met international standards while incorporating traditional Japanese craftsmanship. Sato's work in developing food services for Japanese baseball games created a unique fusion cuisine that combined American recreational foods with Japanese ingredients and preparation methods. His innovations in adapting hot dog and hamburger concepts to Japanese tastes helped establish food service industries that would become integral to Japan's modern recreational culture. The yakitori dog, a hot dog made with grilled chicken and served with traditional Japanese seasonings, became one of the most popular adaptations of American recreational food culture. The dish represented the successful integration of foreign recreational traditions with indigenous culinary heritage that characterized Japan's post-war cultural development. The correspondence that continued between former prisoners and their American guards provided ongoing channels for cultural exchange that facilitated Japan's integration into international recreational and sporting communities. These personal relationships helped overcome official barriers and political tensions that might otherwise have limited cooperation. Sullivan's decision to visit Japan in 1948 as part of an athletic exchange program represented the fulfillment of promises made during his friendship with Nakamura at Camp McCoy. His work in establishing coaching programs and equipment donation systems helped provide American expertise for Japan's developing baseball infrastructure. The reunion between Sullivan and Nakamura on a baseball field in Hiroshima created symbolic recognition of the transformation that had occurred through recreational programs. The sight of former enemies working together to teach Japanese children American games provided powerful evidence of reconciliation that transcended formal diplomatic agreements. Standing on that field in Hiroshima, teaching kids how to swing a bat in the shadow of the atomic bombing, I finally understood what we had really accomplished at Camp McCoy. Sullivan wrote to his family after the visit. We hadn't just passed time playing games, we had planted seeds of friendship that were now growing into something beautiful and lasting. The success of baseball programs in post-war Japan exceeded all expectations, with the sport becoming one of the most popular recreational activities in the country within a decade of the war's end. Professional leagues, school programs, and community teams reflected the comprehensive adoption of American recreational culture that had been facilitated by former prisoners' knowledge and enthusiasm. The Japan Professional Baseball League, established in 1950, included several former prisoners of war among its organizers and coaches. Their understanding of both American baseball traditions and Japanese cultural preferences enabled them to create sporting institutions that served both recreational and social integration purposes. The cultural legacy of recreational programs at Camp McCoy extended beyond baseball to influence broader approaches to international relations and conflict resolution. The demonstration that former enemies could develop genuine friendships through shared recreational activities provided models for people-to-people diplomacy that would prove valuable in other post-conflict situations. The academic studies that eventually emerged from the Camp McCoy experience documented the effectiveness of recreational programs for prisoner rehabilitation and cultural exchange. Dr. Morrison's research became foundational literature for developing humanitarian approaches to prisoner treatment that emphasized human dignity and the possibility of redemption. By 1960, baseball had become so thoroughly integrated into Japanese culture that few participants remembered its origins in prisoner-of-war recreational programs. The former enemies who had played together at Camp McCoy had become grandfathers, teaching their grandchildren games that represented the successful transformation of conflict into cooperation. The hot dog stands that became standard features at Japanese baseball games served as daily reminders of the cultural exchange that had occurred between former enemies. The fusion of American recreational foods with Japanese baseball culture created lasting symbols of international friendship that transcended the political circumstances that had originally brought the cultures together. Nakamura's final letter to Sullivan, written shortly before Nakamura's death in 1975, captured the lasting significance of their shared experience. When I see children playing baseball in Japan today, I remember that cold day in Wisconsin when you first taught me to hold a bat. You showed me that enemies could become friends, that competition could build understanding rather than hatred. This may be the most important lesson of the war, that people who seem different can find common ground when they play together. The legacy of recreational programs at prisoner-of-war camps represented one of the most successful examples of cultural diplomacy in American military history. The transformation of detention facilities into venues for international understanding demonstrated that even the most challenging circumstances could create opportunities for building bridges between former enemies. The baseball fields, hot dog stands, and friendships that emerged from the Camp McCoy experiment provided foundations for Japanese-American cooperation that would prove essential for maintaining peace and stability in the Pacific region throughout the Cold War and beyond. The recreational activities that had begun as simple diversions for imprisoned soldiers had evolved into instruments of international reconciliation that helped shape the post-war world. The incredible story of Japanese POWs discovering hot dogs and baseball in American camps reveals one of World War II's most unexpected chapters of cultural exchange. What began as recreational therapy for depressed prisoners became a powerful bridge between enemies, transforming suspicion into friendship through the universal languages of sport and shared meals. From the first bewildering encounters with America's national pastime to the establishment of baseball leagues throughout post-war Japan, these former prisoners carried more than just knowledge of games back home. They brought understanding of American values and culture that would help rebuild their devastated nation. The hot dogs shared between former enemies became symbols of a friendship that transcended the horrors of total war. What surprised you most about how quickly these prisoners embraced American recreational culture? Could you imagine former enemies becoming such close friends through something as simple as baseball games and shared meals? Share your thoughts in the comments about how sports and food can bring people together across the deepest divides. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button for more amazing stories of how humanity can triumph over conflict through the most unexpected connections.